Tantra. This word is everywhere in popular culture now. But what does it really mean? You might have seen a lot of silly stuff in modern media and movies linking it to sex, but that isn't actually the half of it. This video explains the difference between what the word meant and what it means now, what it means in the Western world compared to its origins in the East, and then finally I'll elucidate the difference between the practices from India and the Chinese sexual spiritual practices. My name's Matt and welcome to another episode of SHA-Mansplaining. Tantra originated in India over 2,000 years ago and denotes the esoteric traditions of Hinduism and Buddhism. The Sanskrit word literally means loom or warp. It's a term that translates to English roughly as weave. Perhaps it was because tapestry sits on a framework and that threads are spun out and woven together to form a systematic whole, to form a carpet or whatever, that this word became a metaphor implying interweaving threads of traditions and teachings all coming together into a principal practice. So while the word itself came from the tradition of weaving cloth in India, Tantra came to mean any systematic and applicable theory, system, method, practice, or technique. So when you hear Tantra, just think technique. Over time, other spiritual texts in India came to adopt the term to also mean rule, method, practice, teaching, and eventually chapter of a book. So the term became applied to almost any kind of teaching found in spiritual scriptures and books. That's why you'll typically find tantras about things like spiritual wisdom and spiritual practices. Tantras are at their core teachings. Tantras are teachings. Some tantras contain instructions on how to perform special rituals or construct a temple, for example. The tantras are numerous and diverse and come from both Buddhist and Hindu traditions. So it's not really accurate to refer to them as a whole corpus or like a finished systematic body of work. They're more like a library of manuscripts that have been collated over a long, long time. During the lengthy period of time that scholars have been studying these scriptures, we've given them our own connotations and interpretations, which are sometimes inaccurate or in some cases completely invented. For example, the connotation of the word itself, Tantra, to be implied to mean an esoteric practice or a religious or sexual ritual is a colonial era European invention. However, it did of course stick, so that's how we use the word now. But it's not really the whole story. This is because tantric texts and practices cover a vast range of topics, mainly focused on spiritualism. And there aren't actually many tantras about the act of sex itself, apart from some exceptional and secret practices from left-hand traditions like Kaula and hidden esoteric traditions in Buddhism. Even then, scholars argue on whether the teachings and practices in those traditions are meant to be taken literally or figuratively. For example, some of the traditions involving sexual ritualism include the use of certain taboo substances, such as blood, semen, alcohol, and even urine, as ritual offerings and sacraments to the spirits. But these were often replaced with less taboo substances, such as yogurt or wine. Perhaps these devices were simply used to help devotees transcend behaviors that might be considered unhelpful to their spiritual development, while at the same time emphasizing that sex isn't necessarily a shameful or a bad thing, and it can be used spiritually. Western religions have traditionally portrayed sexuality as a shameful and bad thing. So when ideas of sexuality were being imported to the West late last century, the countercultures of the progressive hippy and free love movements were very quick to seize upon the idea that all Eastern spiritual philosophies regarded sex as a deeply sacred and spiritual act, and thus sacred sex as a product was born in the West. However, esoteric sex practices were actually looked down upon by Orthodox Hindus and Buddhists. And the rites were secret and only for the spiritually initiated, or occultists rather. Neo-Tantra invented itself by reimagining ideas that originated with these esoteric Hindu sects. One example is Kaula. They also cited rare Vajrayana rituals, symbolic concepts such as Yab-Yam, Shiva Shakti, and pointing at the Kama Sutra. So it started to look more and more legitimate, but these concepts and practices were rather bluntly culturally appropriated, a little bit misunderstood, and I think they continue to be misunderstood to this day. The problem was that there was nothing really solid from these esoteric occult teachings to draw on. Sacred sex is a beautiful idea, but there was no meat on the bone when they were inventing this stuff. Therefore, Western sacred sex is a little bit of an awkward mishmash. Writers and workshop leaders in 1970s California took these oversimplifications appropriated from tantric esotericism and began blending them with elements of Western sexology, psychotherapy, self-transformational techniques, and couples intimacy coaching. Now, what was created was truly unique, groundbreaking, and valuable. Of that, I'm certain. But it is Western innovation and not particularly rooted in ancient sacred Indian tradition. Nonetheless, it hit America like a bomb. One of the most influential books that brought Neo-Tantra into mass consciousness was The Art of Sexual Ecstasy, The Path of Sacred Sexuality for Western Lovers. Written by Margot Anand and first published in 1989, the title is pretty self-explanatory, I think. She was a student of the infamous Neo-Tantrist Osho and founded her own school of modern sexuality called Skydancing Tantra. She went on to publish another dozen or so books, and it's mainly these works and the stuff that was done at the Esalen Institute in California that has informed subsequent incarnations of sacred sex in the West. In a nutshell, what you can take away from all of this is that Neo-Tantra is about 40 years old, and this New Age industry of sexological therapy practices has been mostly culturally appropriated and blended with Western stuff. So it's socio-sexual group therapy invented by Westerners for Westerners. So to recap, just remember, if you're talking about ancient esoteric teachings, use the word Tantra. If you're talking about modern Western sacred sex, use the phrase Neo-Tantra. To further impress or disappoint your friends at dinner parties, you can tell them that the infamous Kama Sutra is in fact not actually a sex manual at all. Never has an ancient Sanskrit text been more widely translated, hyped, abused, or misunderstood. Yes, there are some colourful drawings of sexual positions at the back of the text, but it is essentially a manual about how to be a man about town, and its focus is on leading a fulfilling life. Yes, it's the original and earliest self-help manual for men, and gives advice on how to be an upstanding gent in Indian society, and covers such topics as how to find a wife, how to please your wife, and how to love your life. It is a guide to the art of living and includes such sagely advice as always keep breath freshness next to the bed, how to woo a woman, when to make the first move, and exactly how to go about doing that. It is cited as being the single most pirated book in history, maybe because Western culture wasn't mature enough to publish earnest manuals on how young men should conduct themselves in society. You know, we don't publish manuals on how young men should learn foreplay, courtship, and the art of satisfying a woman in bed. But the Hindus did. Much like Playboy magazine, most people simply flip to the pictures instead of actually reading the articles. So there's nothing particularly spiritual or sexual about the Kama Sutra, or Neo-Tantra for that matter, but for some reason this stuff is all marketed as sacred, authentic, and original. So how did it all come to this? To explain that, we need a quick history lesson. 2,000 or so years ago, the spiritual movement of Tantra began in the northwest of India and rapidly spread throughout the whole country, crossing many linguistic, cultural, and regional boundaries, including the Himalayas. It eventually established itself in China, Tibet, Japan, and even Bali. It attracted the attention of monks, lamas, nuns, yogins, lay people, kings, and queens. Because of its huge geographical and historical spread, the movement is quite hard to define succinctly, which is why the aspects of it that are cherry-picked by Neo-Tantrists can seem very authentic. What we can be sure about is that a considerable basis of Tantra was feminine orientated, or based around Shakti worship. And it was based on demonology, the worship of fearsome, flesh-eating female demons capable of bestowing godlike powers on their worshippers. It was, at its core, a socio-religious counterculture of magical, shamanic ritual practices that was a radical alternative to the traditional Vedic pathways of spirituality. The practices ranged from the downright sacrilegious and taboo to the extremely subtle and refined. In Japan, this manifested as having sex with female nature spirits guised in the form of animals. In Tibet, esoteric Buddhism birthed a focus on uniting the subtle astral qualities of male and female. And in India, some extreme sects championed group sex and body fluid rituals. Perhaps you can see how the West seized upon particular parts from India and cherry-picked them to suit their needs. During the counterculture revolutions that started in the 60s, the importation of Hindu mysticism and free love was used as a rebuttal to the overly controlling Christian values around sex and women in society. It was easy to combine the idea of sacred sexual union and social freedom, and the hippie spiritual seekers were wearing rose-tinted glasses, both literally and figuratively. You can't blame them because images of sexual union abound everywhere in ancient tantric art, and many tantric scriptures include lengthy discussions on sexual practice. However, much like the epics of the Greek gods, which describe Zeus making love for days on end to birth entire worlds or other gods, for example, these artworks and discussions were allegorical means to an end. And sex itself wasn't the end goal, something that modern media representation has missed. Even in the most extreme ancient practices, the goal of sexual ritual was to obtain sexual fluids which were then eaten or offered to deities in order to get ahead spiritually, not simply for the sake of having wild orgies. In Neo-Tantra, the goal seems to be addressing intimacy and socio-sexual issues. Neo-Tantra is mainly concerned with feeling sexual and feeling okay with feeling sexual. But there's little focus on what to do with the sexual energy, apart from some rather vague associations with kundalini and chakras and so forth. Now this brings us to a most important distinction, the difference between Taoist or Chinese Tantra and Neo-Tantra. So my work is chiefly concerned with the ancient Chinese practices of Neidan and Neijian. These are internal martial arts concerning alchemical sexuality and transformative spirituality. These practices were closely guarded secrets and have only become known in the West thanks to Master Mantak Chia, who could rightfully be held up as the Bruce Lee of Taoism, the first Chinese man to teach and transmit these practices to a Western audience. Taoist Tantra has thankfully not been as misinterpreted and appropriated as the Indian esoteric practices, and thus remains relatively pure. It is highly functional and seen more as an esoteric martial art than a pseudo-spiritual socio-sexual movement. Sexual Kung Fu teaches you how to transform sexual energy into spiritual energy. It is more of a process or a martial arts system, and less like a lifestyle product. If you want more information on this, then it is worth taking a look at my video on Kundalini and checking out my courses on sexual Kung Fu. Just go to SHA-Man.com. Links are below. I have only briefly touched on this fascinating and deep history of Tantra here, and I'm not an expert scholar. If you want to investigate this subject further, I can recommend the work of David Gordon White, to whose research I am indebted for the creation of this video. I will put links to his work below. So that's it for another installment of SHA-Mansplaining. Please share, comment, like, and subscribe.